Conditional Release Program, a podcast that delves into the netherworld of cults, crims, and con artists. We don't like these people and it shows. We believe the best way to expose them is to hold them up to a harsh light, point our index fingers in their general direction, and mock them mercilessly, take them down a peg or two until they cease to exist in any other form than the shit on our shoes. I'm Jack the Insider, otherwise known as Peter Hoisted for tax purposes.
And I'm Joel Hill, and we're headed into some very interesting territory in this episode and taking advantage of Jack's vast knowledge of crims in Australia. I'm very excited about this one.
Well, I'm wearing 3 pairs of underpants. I could shit my pants at any given time because today we are going to take a look at the causes of crime. Hard, violent crime. I think of the scariest people you've ever heard of, the pantheon of gangsters, mass murderers, and glass-eyed stone killers. I can think of a few right now. People who kill you with a smile and hurl you into a chipper with a bottle of terps so your legs don't get caught up in the blades.
How are these monsters created, though? Was it nature, nurture? How do you turn into a sociopathic murderer? Is it rock music? Like shock jock dickheads demanding our government's been tough on crime? I need someone to blame, Jack!
Don't worry, Joel. We'll find plenty of people to blame. And in order to find out who, we're going to have to go back, way back, when these monsters were trusting innocent children and have a long, hard look at their lives as they unfolded. We're going to find many of these violent characters have a lot in common.
And sadly, we don't have to look back too far to see the horrors inflicted upon wayward children. And we'll look to the present generation in youth detention and see whether our society is still in the monster creation business.
And we'll get right on it in our deeper dive. But first, it's time for the Conditional Release Program's weekly news. What is going on with Hunter Biden's laptop and why won't mainstream media get on it?
Well, mainstream media won't get on it because it's probably full of shit. So you may have heard something about Hunter Biden's laptop being left at a repair shop with the contents being sent to the FBI and then, of course, to America's favourite mayor, Rudy Giuliani.
Straight to Rudy. Straight to Rudy. Law enforcement first, straight over to Rudy after that.
Do not pass go. It's just like the whole story is bullshit and looking into it has been super difficult. Like Giuliani calls it the laptop from hell, and honestly, separating the truths from the half-truths, the downright fiction is genuinely hard. So the laptop was given to the New York Post, and even the reporters there are starting to distance themselves from it because it's completely sketchy. Essentially, they've given this to a couple of outlets, Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, and they are refusing to put their name to it properly either. A whole bunch of right-wing hacks are really pushing it, but legitimacy is really lacking. So GTV, which is basically a Chinese billionaire's fake news website, they're pushing it really hard, and no one with any shred of credibility is prepared to really touch it in depth, and a lot of talking head commentators, including some of our own, are happy to go out on a limb, but realistically they're speculating, and the entire thing is based on smoke and mirrors. The best theory I've heard is that it's a compilation of blackmail items that they've made into a form of some sort of laptop to give it some sort of tangible credibility, but like any conspiracy, it falls apart because there's too many players and things go wrong, and when the cracks form, people start to have doubts. Like, this story has so many players and so many wild claims, the whole thing just becomes invalid because where there's always a kernel of truth in these conspiracies, they tend to obscure that kernel in a mountain of shit.
Big mountain, big stinking fetid mountain of shit.
This one's got those little steam waves coming off it. So, to be fair, there is one thing I can say with confidence. I believe, to the best of my senses and abilities, that I have seen Hunter Biden's cock.
Well, it's certainly supposed to be. And tell me, Joel, what did it look like? I mean, is it good shape? Girth? Is he a big lad?
Hunter Biden has a pretty decent cock. I'd give it about a 9 out of 10.
Well, there you go.
So, not only that, but it was also wrapped in the feet of an alleged prostitute. And this happened either during or after the act of smoking some crack. So, Jack, look, I remember the days when that was enough. When smoking crack and getting a foot job from a hooker was enough for a decent scandal. But these days, we have to exaggerate fucking everything. A good old sex tape just doesn't cut the mustard. So, the claims of this bloody laptop from hell so far are there's a bunch of emails that place his father in hot water over some sort of pay-for-play corruption charge. You know, China, Russia, fucking wah.
Vague though.
100%.
Nothing specific. Yes.
Oh, God forbid you might get sued. Pictures of naked underage women, because no conspiracy theory in 2020 is complete without a few fucking kids. And the interesting thing here is that the FBI have the laptop. They would arrest Biden if this were true. But of course, It's not fucking true. No, it's all bullshit. So, Rudy Giuliani claims the photos are disgusting and will shock the hell out of you, which is just, vague enough to keep him out of trouble, as we said. But he also said this was authentic as hell, which is actually really funny because he used a made-up scary place to create a metaphor for authenticity. So,
if there's a hell there, Joel, I'm pretty sure Rudy's on his way there sooner or later. And I think when he looks at the mirror and he's having a shave in the morning, I think he understands it.
I think he's in the 7th layer already. So Hunter is also pictured showing off his new tattoo of the Finger Lakes in Michigan. Now, honestly, the tattoo fucking sucks. And it's already on public record. It's been in the newspapers and things like that because people seem to give a shit about what he's got on his back. But the hilarious thing is the Anons think this is due to a tunnel network of mole children, of course, under the Finger Lakes. So,
he's got a map.
Well, of course.
He's got a map of where he's secreted children on his back.
It's the first thing I think of. When I think about my mole children, I just have to put a tattoo on my back to make sure I remember where they are.
Tattooing hard evidence of pedophilia on your back is a pretty sure way to get a jury to convict, I would have thought, Joel. They just rip Hunter's shirt off and bingo, he's guilty.
Yeah, the glove doesn't fit, right? So, and of course, the repair guy that handed the laptop to Giuliani, he thinks that Clinton's going to murder him because of the Clinton body count.
Hillary or Bill?
Look, honestly, I'd say Hillary. He's probably got a little secret crush on Bill. They're weird like that.
Yeah, I have noticed.
The whole story is a fucking mess, but the real takeaway from this is the Overton window has shifted so far that a video of you getting a foot job from a prostitute while smoking crack is no longer enough to tarnish your name.
Standards have slipped, Joel. And it's been a huge week in Melbourne. With the entire population of 5 million breaking out of 100-day lockdown and getting on the beers. Now, I'm a Melbourne boy, Joe, as you may know, and what I remember most about the place is when Melburnians decide to get on the beers, they do make a very fine fist of things. And I'm old enough to remember when a family day at the cricket at the G meant dragging a 75-litre plastic bin full of ice and piss into Bay 13, drinking the entire contents by stumps and having a couple of cleansers on the way home. Get stuck in, Melbourne. You've earned it.
Well, maybe not all Melburnians, Jack, because there was yet another freedom protest defiling the Shrine of Remembrance again, and the usual cast of sovsits, anons, anti-vaxxers, 5G lunatics and hooligans without the nads to barrack for a decent soccer team, annoying the cops and shitting on Australia's war debt in a desperate attempt to be noticed.
I did see a great deal of the ugliness, Joe, with thanks to Cam Smith and his Twitter feed. From the footage, I noticed a few of the older coppers there pining for a good old-fashioned baton charge. You could see it in their faces. They were raring their way in and just start swinging. And perhaps they should have, because about an hour later, one of the more insane among the protesters belted one of the police horses with a flag. And what sort of pond life hits a horse when it's not in a race? And a masked horse botherer decamped into the throng, and I just hope the Wallopers caught up with him and gave him a Victoria Police Force special. Our friends in blue like to call it a hamburger with a lot. Take it from me, you don't want one, Joel, and if you're ever offered one, knock it back.
Yes, and meanwhile, Jack, in America, there are Americans.
Yes, always. It'll be a tremendous place if they weren't there.
Especially around the White House, Jack, which is oozing coronavirus again.
Oh,
there are great big drops of the virus dripping off the eaves of the White House and splashing onto people's heads as they run the gamut of certain death whenever they turn up at the Rose Garden, which, if you're a Trumper, is pretty much every Sunday these days.
It's kind of like playing Russian roulette with a 9mm Glock, Joel.
Indeed it is. And now in the Vice President's office, more than half are down for the count.
Yes. And what do you think's going on there, Joel? Do you think they're trying to get Big Gay Mike out of the way?
Is it a conspiracy to kill off Big Gay Mike and replace him with the original VP pick, the not-so-deceased JFK Jr.? Our friends in the QAnon universe seem to think so.
Well, that can't be good news for JFK Jr.'s nemesis, Bill Gates. But wouldn't Donnie Jr. have his eye on the Veep's gig? Eric might too, but he is the ultimate fail son, the Trump throwback who somehow managed to navigate his way into something bearing some vague resemblance to a human being. And poor old Eric is the one who cheers his dad on Twitter. Always tells us how proud he is of Dad. Love you, Dad! And of course, it goes unrequited, unanswered. I don't think the great orange lizard even bothers to press the like button on Eric's tweets. Love you, Dad! Yeah. Busy, son. Of course, Eric is too stupid to feed himself if he ever lost all of Dad's money, but he's not thinking about that. He's thinking about how much he loves his dad. And if it came to a choice between all the trappings and trimmings of wealth or the love of his old man, he'd pick love every time. And the only trouble is, every time he reaches out to his dad, whether in person or on the socials, Dad gives him the arsehole. No good will come of it, Joel. I give Eric a great big hug, but he might well be a super spreader and kill me and my entire family.
Leave Eric with his pain, Jack. There's nothing we can do to help him anymore.
All right, Joel. Fuck Eric. And that was the news that was this week. There isn't any more. I had a good look around, rummaged behind the couch cushions, and even went through your bin, Joel. You should recycle more, by the way. But there wasn't any news. That's all the news we have this week. There ain't no more, and that means it's time to put our serious faces on and get stuck into our deeper dive.
So, Jack, you've spent a long time looking at the careers of seriously violent men. Most people put this down to poverty, but the viciousness of these criminals surely can't be explained by just a lack of cash on hand.
Well, the causes of crime are complex. And in general terms, the major cause is poverty. And not just economic, but intellectual and emotional poverty. A sort of a failure to connect with people beyond a narrow group of peers. I want to talk today about the effects that incarceration itself has. And in Australian history, of course, European contact established most of this country, at least as a penal colony. So we've got form, as it were, as a pretty brutal place. But what we've done really from the 19th century onwards is follow, as we did with so many other of our institutions, establish the sort of British models. And we established British models of prisons here and added to them a certain Australian flavour. And they were horrible places. They largely did not change from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century and beyond. They were horrible places. And people who went through them were lucky to come out, the chances of them being rehabilitated were very, very scarce. And these places were, in fact, as you said before, basically monster creation places, environments.
Yeah. They were breeding grounds of criminals.
It's what criminologists refer to as the criminogenic effects of incarceration, that the four walls that men and women are locked up in drive recidivism. And generally speaking, the worse the place, the more likely you are to reoffend. It's sort of almost counterintuitive, but the worse the place is, the worse the detention centre or prison is, the more likely is that people will re-enter them at some point in their lives. And see, prisons are often described as sort of crime colleges. In the old days, in Pentridge used to be known as the Bluestone College. People who'd go in, men who'd go in with apprenticeships, would leave with master's degrees in crime. And I want to look at how this worked in reality and go back half a century or more to Australia's youth detention places as a sort of case study on how governments get things so horribly wrong and create horrific environments that essentially create monsters who are then released into society only to exact revenge on the community, on people like yourself and myself. Now, our youth prisons were disgraceful places where violence and sexual assault were routine, and it was based largely on the UK Borstal system.
What's the Borstal system?
Well, it was a crazy means of establishing order in youth detention facilities. The discipline was, at a certain level, was doled out by the more senior inmates. So if they were 16, 17, advanced physically, let's say, then they were the ones who handed out the beatings. I mean, this was all overseen by the guards, and the guards would come in and certainly do a fair bit of the physical work themselves. Sexual assaults were routine. And these rather grim places kids would go into, particularly at their earlier at their early adolescent years, 12, 13, 14, be monstered by older kids, be monstered by guards, and then come out. And what we see is that virtually every major criminal in Australian history has gone, or so many of them have gone through boys' homes at one point or another. John Frederick Chow Hayes went through Gosford Boys' Home, and that was in the second decade of the 20th century. And then we have names, as I say, household names like Leonard Arthur Mcpherson, who was considered the Mr. Big of Sydney crime for 20 years. The man who stood alongside him, Stan Smith, was another one who went through the boys' home system. And George Freeman, that triumvirate of Australian crime, Mcpherson, Smith and Freeman, known as the team, George also went through Gosford Boys' Home. The list is long. Nettie Smith was another one. Mittagong, Gosford. Christopher Dale Flannery down in Victoria. He was at the Morning Star Boys' Home run by the Franciscans, and he was sexually assaulted there and brutalised there as well, as I understand it, having spoken to people who knew of his experiences there. I mean, virtually every major crook in Australia in the 1980s and before had been through boys' homes. And I want to concentrate on maybe just a few right now. And what we want to do in later programs is do particular profiles of these guys. They're very interesting. They do share a great deal in common, but they were outrageous criminals who just were as violent as all get out, had no restraint, and but were cunning and shrewd enough to start building themselves empires.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what these boys' homes created. Not everyone who went through a boys' home would go on to become a serious crook. Some would be petty criminals. Others might have, dragged themselves into rehabilitation themselves. Others, of course, might have been so brutalised by their experiences that they were, almost, they couldn't connect with society for the rest of their lives, and they depended on welfare and so forth to get them through almost cradle to grave. But I want to just concentrate on Lenny Mcpherson, Stan Smith and George Freeman, who were essentially the three ultimate figures in Sydney crime in the 1980s. They were all murderers. Freeman at least 2. Stan Smith, 15. Stan was probably the most successful hitman this country's ever seen. Certainly successful in that no one ever pulled him up. He was never even charged. He spent, Stan Smith, 15 murders, 25 shooting incidents, died with an estate of $25 million.
That's a bit
major marijuana distributor and trafficker.
Yeah, that's right.
Extortionist. He spent 3 months in Pentridge. Actually, he spent just 3 months as from the age of 21. He spent just 3 months in prison. But of course, he had been through the boys' homes and had a conviction which dragged him into an adult prison when he was 20.
Yeah,
Len Mcpherson.
3 months is still a good stint.
Len Mcpherson was this big, bullocking character who had a face like a bull elephant's scrotum, and he just bark out orders. You wouldn't see Len necessarily, but you'd hear him because he was just this really loud. His conversation lashed with obscenities. Didn't matter where he was. I spoke to a police officer who used to use him as an informer, and they'd meet in a cafe, and this copper was particularly alarmed about that because once Len walked into the cafe, everyone else had to leave. I mean, he was just that loud and that unpleasant. And
yes,
but Len was again, he used to openly talk about being abused at Gosford Boys Home, sexually and physically.
Yeah.
And all three of these men and others, they would follow a fairly set pattern. They would spend perhaps 1 or 2 stints in boys' homes, and then they would graduate to as adults to prison, short jail prisons, often for violent offending. And by the time they get out in their early 20s, they are simply raring to go, just bristling with anger, so violent, and ready to extract a revenge on anyone. I mean, they consider themselves victims, and they had been victims, but they were never going to be victims again. And so these three men became leading figures in crime. They knew how to play police. They knew how to extort money from villains, from other villains, and anyone else who got in the way because of their reputations. And what we see in their personalities, all three of them, is that they had this extraordinary violence in their 20s and 30s. So Len Mcpherson, when he was first married, of course he wasn't much of a husband, and he'd be staying out night brothels and all sorts of places. And his wife, well, she sort of put up with as much as she could, but if there was ever going to be any conflict, Lenny had, basically beat the living crap out of her. And when finally their marriage came to an end, Mcpherson tied her leg to a tree, one leg to a tree, and the other one of her legs to the back of his car, and proceeded to try and pull her apart. He delivered such an appalling bashing that the corrupt police detective Ray Kelly had to intervene and ensure her safe passage out of the state.
Jeez.
I mean, he wasn't charged. He should have been charged of very serious offences, but none of that happened. It was just about getting the woman away. And Stan Smith, I mean, as a young man, look, I saw a woman give character evidence about Stan Smith, and she said, Stan was lovely, he used to treat us women. And in his middle ages, when he calmed down, sure, he may well have. But as a younger man, and Lenny picked him out of the crowd. He was a good 15 years younger than Lenny, Stan Smith, but he picked him out of the crowd because of his propensity for violence. And Stan Smith and Lenny would visit brothels under their control, or where they were extorting other pimps, and Stan would be beating the hell out of the women there, hanging women by their ankles from the 3rd or 4th story, torturing people, with Lenny running around throwing cash about to pay their medical expenses.
Yeah.
And George Freeman, the sort of the last figure in this triumvirate, and the sort of last piece in the puzzle for the team, because of his gambling expertise. Well, Freeman had also been through the boys' homes, and he was a little guy. I mean, he went to Gosford when he was 13 as a small kid, Yeah,
that's
And so he was always going to be prey when he was like that. And when he got out, he just erupted into violence, particularly when anyone had a go at his height or his size. So he was known. His nickname was Mouse, but woe betide anyone who actually called him that to his face, because he would just grab anything that was handy and just start lashing out with it. And this is what these guys like. And then you see them develop. Into more strategic thinkers. Again, absolutely no sense of regret or remorse about what they do. Very little sympathy for anyone who crosses them. And an understanding that, well, we've got to be worse than everybody else.
That's it.
So our rivals, we'll kill them, and we'll talk about this later, how they were able to do that with impunity, and that involved obviously corrupt police. But they committed murders, and they committed murders with impunity, and one by one their rivals either disappeared or fell into line. and they ran Sydney crime for 20 or 30 years. Or
Yeah.
it was almost 30 years.
Yeah, so Jack, these are standout examples, but not everyone who went through Australia's Borstals went on to be like, mass murdering gangsters.
Well, that's true. And some would never offend again. Some would have the courage to sort of pull themselves out of that cycle and go on to live decent lives. And some similarly would go into a sort of vegetative state, after the abuse that they'd suffered, But whichever way you look at it, it was a failure, So let's talk about the social cost of crime and how the criminogenic effects of incarceration drive the social cost of crime up. Take the example of a young male who goes into prison for car theft. Now, it's going to be more than one car, by the way. So that person's knocked off a series of cars, might be involved in vehicle rebranding and what have you, rebirthing, I should say, and possibly connected to more serious criminals. But that person ends up in jail after having knocked off, let's say, 4 or 5 cars. And the social cost of that crime is the loss of those vehicles, 2 victims. They have lost their cars, and we can sort of put a dollar figure around their loss, and then there's a sense of violation and a loss of trust with society in general.
It's not pleasant.
It's not pleasant at all, and so when we put all those things together, we see what the social cost of that young male's criminal activity has come to. And when that young male goes into prison, spends time there, let's say it's 2 years, and the rule of thumb, by the way, is if you spend more than 2 years in an Australian prison, there is a 2/3 chance that you will return to prison at some later stage. Yeah. And what's more likely is when that young male leaves prison, he goes on to commit more serious offences. And let's say it's aggravated burglaries this time, much more violent offending. The social costs of victimhood are starting to go through the roof. You've got people genuinely traumatised. You've got people genuinely terrified. And you've got people suffering serious injury along the way with this sort of stuff. An aggravated burglary is a home invasion in the sort of media speak.
It's not pleasant.
It's certainly not. And when that young male has committed those offences, having acquired the sort of knowledge to do so, not just that, but lost that sense of connection with the community that makes him think I can go and do this sort of stuff. The social cost has gone through the roof. And when that person gets pulled up, if that person gets pulled up, that young male gets pulled up again and goes back into jail, this time for a longer period, by the time he gets out the third time, there is a very strong likelihood that he will go on to commit very serious offences like murder, all sorts of mayhem. And the social costs balloon again. We could sit around and put a dollar figure on it, but what we started at first was a relatively small social cost, and then through incarceration, the social cost just goes through the roof. And that's what we're trying to stop. I mean, this is not, a small L liberal approach. This is really just good common sense.
And you could say, look, these Borstal systems, these children's homes, these monster factories were objective failures. I mean, the policy behind them are a complete nightmare. Nothing about this makes any kind of social sense. And the issue is here that, of course, it's much more populist to go hard on crime, to stamp down. And when it comes to youth offenders, I mean, we're seeing this in Queensland right now, where there's basically, Frecklington doing the dog whistle on Townsville, and a lot of people in Townsville who are, experiencing a crime wave of kids running around going amok. I mean, it's tricky because do you go soft on crime? Because when you go hard on crime, you get better criminals, and when you go soft on crime, well, there's no consequences. Like, what's the go?
Well, you don't want to be soft on crime. You can't be soft on crime. But when we look at the Mcphersons and the Stan Smith, we can see that in their lifetimes there were opportunities that were lost. An opportunity for an intervention when these men were in their early adulthood, and providing them with education, a sense of purpose, and a prospect of gainful employment. The thing about this is, if you're going to spend money on those sorts of rehabilitative programs, you've got to understand that you're not going to have it's not going to be 100% success rate.
No.
But every one that you turn over is actually got a social benefit.
100%.
So I want to come over also Scott Morrison on our listeners, but the best form of rehabilitation is a job. And through it, a sense of meaning, purpose, and connection with the community, because that's what these kids have often lost.
If you have a go, you get a go, right?
Well, yeah, if you have a go, you commit a murder. I mean, there are programs at work based largely around the crucial months when an individual is set to leave prison. It involves training, preparation, basic things like how to apply for a job, and providing someone with some skills. These things cost money. They cost money. So governments, looking at slashing budgets will cut these things first.
It's investment.
Well, it is. That's the way you've got to look at it, as a form of investment. Just as an example, the Bracks government in Victoria started spending some money, not a lot of money, by the way, on rehab programs for female and male inmates. And for the first time in Victorian history, what we saw in just the space of a few years was recidivism rates in Victoria started shrinking. And it was quite dramatic. You could actually see how the value in spending that money. And they were good programs. They provided people with jobs, connected them with the community, even if it was volunteer work, gave them a sense of purpose. And you start getting out of that, that high threat period 12 months later after they leave prison, and they had developed skills and employment and so forth. So we see recidivism rates dropping in that environment, and compared to the rest of Australia, the Bracks government had done some rather wonderful things. And of course, Bracks retired, and his successor was beaten at the next election, and along came a new government, and the first thing they did was cut those spending programs, those rehab programs, and then we saw the reverse happen. Basically, recidivism rates in Victoria started going back up to their previous highs from 10 years before, and so a lot of wasted stuff. Now, we don't talk about these things because we're soft, small L liberals or we're social justice warriors. So what we're talking about here is reducing, trying to cut the cycle of crime and reduce the social cost. I mean, so. Let's just get with the idea. Let's just stick with that whole concept of tough on crime, which becomes a sort of almost chest beating exercise for politicians, and of course the media runs hard on tough on crime with a tough on crime angle. I mean, if the media had their way, we would all be deadlocked away in our homes. Terrified, absolutely shitting ourselves of what might be going on outside, and consuming a lot of media while we were there, right?
Listening to Drive Time without driving.
That's right. So this whole business of the tough on crime stuff, it's counterproductive. The idea that if we have longer sentences and brutal environments as a form of deterrence simply doesn't work. When an individual commits an offence, he or she is not thinking, oh crikey, there's a mandatory 2 year sentence here. The magistrate won't have any discretion. I'll get 2 years. That doesn't work that way. A person who's about to commit an offence doesn't think, oh yeah, there used to be a 2 year jail sentence for this, but now it's 5, and that will probably put me into a harsher prison environment. Gee, really? Maybe I shouldn't do this. I mean, that's just not the way people who offend think. So the idea of ratcheting up prison sentences is done strictly for punitive sense, it's just for a punitive purpose, and sort of locks people away in environments that are pretty horrible. But they're going to come out, and when they do come out, they're going to extract a bit of revenge. And it's not going to be on the politician or the media proprietor. It's going to be on people like you and me, Joe.
Yeah, and look, this is the thing. So we shouldn't be tough on crime, but we should be at the same time. There's a real paradox here, but one of the things that's really difficult is that the shock jocks have the phone to the Premier. They are demanding we get tougher on crime and criminals, and they're talking to people who vote.
Yeah. And look, I may believe what they're thinking, but every piece of data, statistical evidence, tells you otherwise. And
don't let data get in the way of a good yarn, Jack.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, let's remember the media flourished from crime reporting, right?
Yeah.
And the true crime stuff, well, that's an industry. You know, there are shows on TV, special reports on media websites.
We're doing it right now.
It's an industry. I guess we are. Yeah, and you know, and I've told plenty of crime stories in my time. I mean, and people are fascinated by it.
Yeah.
Look, let's move away from that SJW branding that might come our way if certain folk on the right were having a listen to this. And I've got no problem with serious violent offenders, murderers, serial rapists being banged away for the rest of their lives, or at least until they are too old to pose any sort of risk.
Pedophiles especially.
But we need to understand that the longer we put people away in brutal environments, the criminogenic, that word again, the criminogenic effects of incarceration are likely to lead to more serious, often more violent offending, and the law-abiding folk are the ones paying the price for that.
So you've got people, we put away for as long as bloody possible when they've become monsters. But let's go back to the monster factories. Where are we at today? Because you know about this. Where are we at today with youth detention in Australia? Because after Dondale, honestly, I think there's a lot going on today that we thought had stopped.
At any given time, there are 1,000 kids in detention in Australia, and that's a dramatic decline, almost divided by 20 since Chris Flannery was locked up in Morningstar in the 1950s. So we're getting some things right. But there are alarming figures and really very poor statistics around that relatively small figure. 90% are male. 63% are awaiting trial. And that's an astonishing figure in itself. So of that 100 kids, 630 are banged up in youth detention facilities without having been convicted of an offence. Well, they might have been convicted of offences earlier on, but what they've been charged with has not been brought before the courts. And this is really going to be, and this is an issue that's been growing in the last 10 years. We're finding the courts get backed up. Kids may receive bail, and then if they breach that bail, they go. Certainly in New South Wales, it's mandatory. They go straight into incarceration, and those bail breaches might be relatively minor. It might be a failure to report to police. It might be a failure to work within a curfew.
Driving unlicensed.
Well, it's not even another offence. It's just the offence. Well, the breach of the bail conditions that can take them straight into prison again. In New South Wales, these are mandatory, and elsewhere they're frowned upon by magistrates. So we have, almost 2/3 of 1,000 kids in detention who are awaiting trial. And with COVID, we've found that matters are being pushed back. We're finding also sensibly that bail is being granted more often.
Yeah. But
we're finding now that the average time 5 years ago for a kid facing a criminal matter in the juvenile courts would have to wait up to a year. So a year in detention, would have to wait a year in detention for that matter to be heard. And now with COVID, it's likely that's going to spin further out of control, so further delays. So if someone is on remand in the juvenile justice system, they could wait up to 2 years for their matter to be heard. And I just want to explain what that 2 years would be like for a 15, 16 or 17-year-old boy mainly, or girls too sometimes, and that is they would be spending 23 hours a day in a cell. They would go out for an hour's exercise, and there'd also be times when they eat and when they shower, etc. But essentially 23 hours in a very small cell and not given much else of anything else. So these are really, when we talk about monster creation, that's really sort of tilting at that again.
Yeah.
And of course the really appalling things about youth detention rates are the extraordinarily high levels of Indigenous incarceration.
Yeah.
Indigenous youth in the Northern Territory are 40 times more likely to be incarcerated. In Western Australia, it's 20 times. In every other state or territory, it's around 10 times.
Yep. Yeah, and that's just, it's a shocking statistic because that sort of factor of things is just crazy.
And look, and a lot of it's avoidable. I mean, the territory has higher rates of incarceration than Louisiana. And that's at the top of the tree in the US with a pretty lousy, notorious sort of penal system.
Yeah.
So most of these offences at least begin with minor league property and motor vehicle crimes. There are programs we can get around this. They require a bit of money, a little bit of money, not a lot of money.
Yeah.
So, for example, in remote and they do this actually in New South Wales, but not as much as that they perhaps should. That they'll take a couple of guys who are skilled drivers and with aptitude with kids, and they'll take them out to rural and or remote New South Wales, and they'll put those kids through. Sort of driver ed and driver testing.
Yeah.
Now, it's not the same as young middle-class kids in Sydney or Melbourne who have to go through, 150 hours
of
120 driving in various conditions, 120 under various conditions.
It's a lot.
And some people might say, well, that's unfair, these Indigenous kids are being well looked after. The simple fact of the matter is you want to try and get these people out of the system.
Yep.
And if they've got a driver's licence, that's going to keep them out of the system. They're not going to get pulled over for driving unlicensed for a start.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we've got, and it's still a major issue, particularly in Western Australia, is we have people being locked up for failure to pay fines. And there's a Labor government in place in Western Australia, and they claim, we just can't get through the upper house. But these things are no-brainers.
Yeah.
You don't want people locked up because they haven't paid a $150 fine or $400 fine. I mean, it's just crazy stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
So there are things that can happen that can drop those Indigenous rates. Mainly the fines are for adults, but for youth, it's getting around this very early offending, the property offending, and so forth. And there are better ways of doing that. And some of the other ways that we talk about is basically sitting youth offenders down with their victims, and sort of having a bit of, it's not really a shaming exercise, but it's designed to increase a bit of empathy and a bit of understanding for what they've done, and it can be quite effective. Again, these things are practiced in New South Wales, in Queensland, and Victoria, and maybe elsewhere, but I'm unaware of it. But it's just not done enough.
Yeah.
You see, so these things. They don't attract money, they don't attract funding, they don't attract headlines, because there are no votes in prison reform.
No.
There are just none. But look, there is one thing where Australia is as bad as it gets. If we want to compare ourselves to the United States, we are a mile behind, and that is in the area of putting kids in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
Now, firstly, the American federal prison system won't allow prohibits kids being held in solitary confinement. And they did that in the Obama era because the evidence was in. There was all this neuropsychological data that said if you put kids in solitary confinement, this is what happens. And you can actually see it. You don't even have to be a neurologist. If you hold up the brain scan of a normal 17-year-old up against one who's been in solitary confinement for 3 months, you'll see the structural changes.
Yeah.
I mean, these are brains in development that are denied stimulus.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely totally destructive to the individual. So in the Obama era, the Justice Department went around to a lot of the states and said, you've got to stop these practices. You've got to stop these practices not just because they're horrible, but because you are wide open for multiple very expensive lawsuits.
Yeah.
I mean, destroying a young person's life in the American legal system, that's millions of dollars of compensation right there. And what the Justice Department was telling these state jurisdictions was, with the evidence is in, you cannot dispute this in court. I mean, the best hope you've got is to sit down and settle with them. So one by one, the states, even some of the most notorious states in terms of incarceration, like Texas, have stopped solitary confinement in youth. But in Australia, we keep doing it. And one hopes that the mother of all lawsuits will come their way. But that's really not why we should be stopping it. We should be stopping it because it's harmful. I mean, for all the dance stands out there, prior to COVID, at any given time, there were 20 kids in adult prisons in Victoria who by necessity had to be held in solitary confinement. And that period of solitary confinement could be up to 3 months.
And by necessity is because they're in an adult prison.
Well, that by necessity because if they're placed in, they're just not placed in the general prison populations for their own safety. But in doing so, they create, in placing them in solitary confinement, they create perhaps even bigger problems.
Torture.
I mean, it's not as if some of these kids are going to come out and they're going to be furious and angry.
Absolutely.
And they're going to extract a revenge. But more likely, the neurological effects of solitary confinement are going to lead to young people being left in almost sort of vegetative states. Yeah. They can't really connect with the rest of the community. They basically aren't going to enjoy any sort of intellectual pursuits, and they become really just, for want of a better term, burdens on the state.
You either get a ward of the state or you get a bloody vicious criminal. I mean, where's the win?
Well, yeah, there's simply no win here, and that's why it's simply got to stop. It, as I said, it happens in Victoria, disgracefully. The so-called Massachusetts of the South, so-called progressive government has allowed this to go on. In Western Australia, in Queensland, it has to stop, and it should stop. Well, it should have stopped 10 years ago minimum, but it really has to stop straight away.
Yeah.
And really what we're doing is consigning our youth to lives that can never be fulfilled.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster, and it's one of those things that just keeps on getting cooked. And it's a real shame because for all the money that's saved by putting kids into adult prisons in solitary confinement is spent tenfold in restorative issues down the track. It's madness.
Yeah, it is indeed. I mean, and it's been really great to talk about it. It's a sort of certain passion of mine.
Yeah.
The trouble is, this stuff rarely gets touched on because there are, as we said before, no votes in prison reform.
No.
But this is not about being soft or tough on crime. It's about being smart about it and showing a little bit of compassion along the way. I mean, as a society, we need to show that we are better than our worst members.
Yeah, and the thing is that compassion and a general sense of empathy toward people who are in compromised positions does not sell. It just does not sell. And if you were to throw someone on the morning shift on 2GB in Sydney selling the line that we need to show more compassion to our disadvantaged members of society, they would not last long on the golden microphone. I tell you that right now.
Oh, look, absolutely, I agree. This is a hard sell. I mean, this is a hard sell, but but you've got the way you've got to sell it is, if you want to reduce crime, if you want to reduce the serious offences, then you have to spend a bit of money to rehabilitate people and give them a sense of purpose, and get them out of that cycle
and into society. It can be rewarding.
Bearing in mind, it's not always going to work, and if you do spend a bit of money on a program, and someone goes through it, or goes out and commits some terrible offence, the media will be all over that too.
The failures, blah blah blah, whatever. Yeah,
that's right. So soft on crime. Here we are. Well, they're like, it's like staying in the Hilton. I guarantee you, it's not. I guarantee you, it is being locked up is not being locked up in a hotel. It's like being locked up in your bathroom. Yeah. And if you think it's all right, go and spend 12 hours in your bathroom tonight and see how you get on. Yeah. And then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again, and do it again for a year or 18 months, and then maybe you'll just be before the courts then and having your matter heard.
Have your partner bring you a microwave meal every 8 hours and see how long you last. Yeah. Thanks, Jack. Look, there's a lot to reflect on there. That's it's a heavy episode, this one. That's a lot of thought-provoking stuff, and to be honest, I think I made maybe a bit of a lie down and maybe some counselling to contemplate all that. But there isn't time for that now, because we're going to change the mood a little bit and move on to the segment that I know our listeners sit around like deranged junkies waiting for the fix.
Oh, yes, Joel, a great big fix. A shot in the arm of this program's favourite human being. It's the week in Pete Evans.
It's always a big week in Pete Evans, and this is no exception. Property prospector Pete has snapped up a giant property to hold some kooky wellness retreats. And while wellness retreats are nothing new, I think most of them don't involve lectures at dinner time about mole children. Oh. Unless he's serving up a glass of adrenochrome-rich kid's blood with my salmon, I don't really want to know about it. What are the elites still getting up to? Mate, I'm not there. Very sad. There will be cooking classes, which will probably actually be quite good.
But... You can cook, the boy. Yes, look, I'm just disappointed I wasn't invited. I would have loved to rock up to Pete's place and get on the piss with him, paleo style. How much do you reckon a weekend at Pete Evans' place would cost, Joel?
What price do you put on your dignity, Jack?
Come on, Joel. We're not just activating a handful of almonds and spending the rest of the weekend under the biolamp curing your cancer. And you're bound to walk out with some extra special only at Pete's essential oils, which you can flog to your friends at a profit just like Peter does. And that's a big weekend, Joel. Huge. I'd happily smoke my credit card paying for a weekend.
Mate, it'll pay for itself with the first 2 weeks of hassling your relatives to sell doTERRA to them. But look, as much as I do want to rip shit on this, it does look pretty nice. It's got rolling green hills, but... having some wingnut try to convince me that Donald Trump is a light worker and the royal family are reptilians just doesn't work for me. I've heard it all before. I've done my own research. It's fucking stupid. I can get that down the East Sydney Hotel at a fraction of the price. So you know what? I'm out. Fuck that.
No, well, there you go. So Pete was dragged to the podium this week too and handed a huge award that really nailed some of his finest work.
Yes.
On the socials.
Postulating Pete winning the Bent Spoon Award is absolutely no surprise to anyone paying attention. It's an award given by the Australian Skeptics, and this is his second gong. And for the first time in the award's history, it's been won twice by the same person. Well, he won it first in 2015, but I tell you what, I think he's got it pretty much minced in for the next 4 years.
Yeah. I reckon he's got a
Apparently the reason was because, of course, his ridiculous biocharger lamp, which, to be fair, looks pretty cool, but he's full of shit. and his unwavering promotion of anti-vaccination material.
He hates the needles, Joe, but don't tell me the biocharger lamp doesn't work. I've spent the best part of the last 6 months under
I
it.
hate to say you've wasted your time, Jack, but what's funny is that when Pete posted this on his social media, his supporters congratulated him. The excellent guys at Blocked by Pete Evans on Facebook noticed the comment section for his tongue-in-cheek post were overwhelmingly positive, like he'd won the fucking Nobel Prize for salmon poaching. Yep, the people who are famous for doing their own research failed once again to do their own research.
Don't tell me the people who follow Pete Evans are idiots, Joel. I mean, I find that very hard to believe. Do you honestly think that Pete would deliberately waste his time just so a bunch of idiots would gormlessly follow him? You don't think he's got designs on him? You think maybe some of that MSM might get around to a few idiots? You think that might be the plan? It might
help them out. I tell you what, it's a shocking revelation to me, Jack, and I'm going to spend the entire weekend thinking about it.
What a wonderful man that Pete Evans is. And you have been listening to the Conditional Release Program with your host, Jack the Insider and Joel Hill. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. And if you've enjoyed our bullshit, throw us a 5-star review on your podcast.
Jack can be found on Twitter on @JackTheInsider and Joel @CrunchyMoses with a K. We've set up a Facebook page, which if you search for the Conditional Release Program, you can pretty much find.
And finally, all feedback, tips and death threats should be sent to the Conditional Release Program @gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, even if it's simply to tell us that you have plans to murder us and put us in a chipper with a couple of litres of terps just to make sure our legs get all the way through.
Thanks, listeners. I'll catch you next week.
Bye now.